Welcome, everyone. This is All Minus One Story Time with your favorite host, me, Bill. How are we doing today? So, guys, if you aren't aware, this segment is a segment where I read great books from great influential leaders. Really, the point of doing this is to provide you all with information so that you don't have to go so far to look for it. And I like to read anyways, so why not share what I'm reading with the audience? So right now we are covering Klaus Schwab's The Great Reset. That is his corporatist, semi-fascistic stakeholder capitalism system in which he wishes to set up, and his selling point, and that the current pandemic is the reason we must implement this. Because if we do not implement this, the world cannot be sustained. Of course, all this has agendas of environmentalism and equity, that is, racial equity, and all kinds of other left-wing nonsense. So, without much further ado, let's get into it. We are at 1.2.2, growth and employment. Since before March of 2020, never had the world economy come to such an abrupt and brutal stop. Never before had anyone alive experienced an economic collapse so dramatic and drastic both in its nature and pace. The shock that the pandemic inflicted on the global economy has been more severe and has occurred much faster than anything else on recorded economic history, even the Great Depression in the early 1930s and the global financial crisis in 2008. It took several years for the GDP to contract by 10% or more and for unemployment to soar above 10%. Okay, let's correct the record here. The pandemic did nothing. The government shut everything down. The end. End of story. End of argument. This is not having to do with the pandemic. If people were sick, like we saw briefly in meat packing plants at the very beginning of this, there will be some supply lines, slowdowns, shutdowns, whatever. That lasts briefly. No one's talked about it since the beginning of this thing. The economic shutdowns are direct actions of the governors and the city councils, the county councils, board members, whatever they are in your area. That's what these are a reflection of. They have nothing to do with the organic need to shut things down because people were so sick and dying that they could not go to work. Right? We go back to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was prolonged by centralized economy, by centralized planning, by the government intervention. The economic crash of 1920 bounded right back up the next year, and the reason why is because there was no intervention, so the market could do its natural thing. Same with the financial crisis in 2008, which was completely invented by the government and the stock market and the businesses, and the need to give every American a home, even if it was $1 million home and they made $75,000 a year. Obviously, that was not a market force. That was centralized control economy, because anyone who understood anything about basic markets knows that someone who makes $75,000, $150,000 a year even cannot afford $1 million home. That's absurd. But that's the stuff that folks do because we have this crazy controlled economy. So with all that, his 10% numbers don't mean anything. Funny when the deregulation came, and there was still a lot of regulation, but when the deregulation came under Trump, how we had record unemployment lows. But see, these folks, they can't allow you to know the truth. They must keep you enslaved. And because you listen to the experts, you believe everything that they say. Let's continue. With the pandemic, disaster like macroeconomic outcomes, in particular, exploding unemployment levels and plunging GDP growth happened in March 2020 over the course of just 3 weeks. The coup inflicted a crisis of both supply and demand that led to the deepest dive on record for the global economy in over 100 years. again, I would disagree. I haven't seen the numbers directly, so we'd have to look at that specifically for me to have a full disagreement, like a real point here. But what I am saying is that it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems, once again, that the supplied side of things had to do with we had outsourced the majority of our manufacturing to China, and much of the world had, and we weren't taking care of ourselves. And when you're relying on your potential enemy, the source of competition as far as world powers, to manufacture everything for you, you might come to a position where they decide, hey, we're going to cut you off. Which we saw happen. Of course, Mr. Schwab isn't going to talk about any of this because Xi Jinping spoke at Davos, the World Economic Forum, this past year and several years ago. They are buddy-buddy. As the economist Kenneth Rogoff warned, everything depends on how long it lasts, but if it goes on for a long time, it's certainly going to be the mother of all financial crises. Well, that's interesting because it's the governments that allow them to prop up, because free markets don't allow these actions to happen, because a business fails on its merits and poor economic planning fails on its merits, and there are no bailouts, there are no long trickle effects that affect folks for generations. Basically, there's a hard hit up front. There's hardship. The community or some businessman comes along, absorbs that hit, and that's about it. Usually someone buys up the assets as they are liquidated for much cheaper, and they rebuild. That's what happens. That's what should happen. It's not what we allow to happen, because we have all these things. Well, whoa, these people can't become poor. And trust me, guys, most of the people that fail are folks like Donald Trump, who were quite wealthy. They file bankruptcy, and because of the way the laws are set and the game is rigged, they get to keep all their wealth. And this is how it works, guys. It's literally the game. If it happens to you or me, we're kind of screwed. We don't have hard assets, and our credit gets screwed, and guess what? We get shipped off to the lanes of poverty. The length and acuteness of the downturn and its subsequent hit to growth and employment depend on three things: the duration and severity of the outbreak, each country's success at containing the pandemic and mitigate its effects, the cohesiveness of each society in dealing with post-confinement measures, and the various opening strategies. At the time of writing, end of June 2020, all three aspects remain unknown. Renewed waves of outbreak, big and small, are occurring. Countries' success at containing the outbreak can either last or suddenly be revised by new waves, and society's cohesion can be challenged by renewed economic and social planning. Again, this all goes back to planning because this is an authoritarian type approach. Now, guys, normally I read this section by section, but because that was a very brief section, I'm going to continue, and hopefully we'll get through this within a half an hour or so. So, economic growth. At different moments between February and May 2020, in a bid to contain the pandemic, governments worldwide made the deliberate decision to shut down much of their respective economies. And there it is. There it is. I think this is like the eighth one of these I've done. Section after section after section. Now, don't get me wrong, they're small sections. And these videos are only 30 minutes long because I'm running my mouth with commentary in between the author's writings here. But I've been saying it all along, and this is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the first time that Klaus Schwab has said this specifically, that they deliberately made the decision to shut things down. Yet this entire chapter prior, he's saying that the COOF did it. It was the COOF's fault. No, it was the government's fault. The government, at least in the United States, had no right to do such a thing at all. Your First Amendment right, your freedom of association, includes your business. The end. Your Ninth Amendment right is the right of the people. There is no right in the federal Constitution for the federal government. There is no power for the federal government to regulate your business. They can only regulate between states and across state lines. Again, very important point with the current gun bill, H.R. 8, that is being pushed, where they're trying to regulate interstate commerce. intra, not inner or in between, intrastate commerce, commerce within each state. It is not constitutionally viable. It's a violation of the 10th and 9th Amendment alone. But also, again, we go back to that First Amendment to peaceably assemble. And business is peaceful assembly, folks. This unprecedented course of events has brought with it a fundamental shift in the way the world economy operates, marked by an abrupt and unsolicited return to a form of relative autarky. I don't know that word. With every nation trying to move towards certain forms of self-sufficiency and a reduction in national and global output. Well, there's going to be a reduction of output, both nationally and globally, when the governments decide to shut everything down. What the real consequence is, though, nothing to the government. The real consequence is to the people, because the people can't work, which means that they will be left impoverished. Poverty, folks, isn't a level of wealth either that is comparable to your neighbor. It is a state of basic needs being met or not being met. And if there's a struggle to have those basic needs to be met, then you are impoverished. If you have your basic needs met, you are not. And I'm sorry if that's a wake-up call to some of you out there, because many of you talk about how poor you are. I mean, I may even sort of jokingly say I'm poorish because I'm under that $100,000 a year threshold, in my household. Not to tell you all what we pull in or anything, but I'm just saying, like, anyone underneath that is going to have a little bit more of a difficult time. About 10 years ago, they said once you hit about 80 grand, that you are not worrying about bills anymore. Your needs are met. Unfortunately, though, that number has changed drastically as we have hit a large amount of inflation, and will hit a ton more as the Board of Governors in the United States of the Federal Reserve have printed more money than they have ever printed since Bretton Woods was disposed of by Nixon back in 1970 or 71, whatever that was specifically. I think it was 1970. We are not in a good spot as a nation, and Europe probably will not be doing much better as they are having their own economic issues and dealing with their own centralized government within the European Union. In any case, this self-sufficiency idea should have always existed, because you must be self-sufficient. To rely on your neighbor is absurd. To need your neighbor's help and to have a symbiotic relationship is something different. But you should never be completely in symbiosis with somebody, if you would, unless it is your family, your wife, or your children. And the reason for that is because, again, at any point, things happen. Relationships can change. People move away. Disasters. All kinds of things. And honestly, worst comes to worst, people pass. Death happens. So you must always be prepared within yourself as well to take over and do what you must. And we don't think like that anymore because we have so much luxury. We have people that live in luxury in this nation who literally believe that they are impoverished because they have never been to third world nations. I was a young 21-year-old man, or 22-year-old man, forgive me, in Iraq, and recall driving through the countryside and just seeing the poverty there. And it was quite eye-opening. And it's like I knew it existed anyways. Like I'd known it was there. I'd seen TV, right? But you really do see the difference in the difference of standard of living. Anyways, let's keep going. It says the impact of these decisions seemed all the more dramatic because they concerned first and foremost service industries and sector traditionally more immune than the other industries like construction or manufacturing. To the cyclical swing of economic growth, consequently, the service sector represents. Man, I'm just not going to be able to read today, folks. Consequently, the service sector that represents by far the largest component of economic activity in any developed economy, about 70% of GDP, and more than 80% of employment in the U.S., was hit the hardest by the pandemic. Let me read that again. The impact of these decisions seem all the more dramatic because they concern, first and foremost, service industries and sectors traditionally more immune than other industries. No. Because if we go back to your first sentence, the government shut this down. Every job is essential to the person who has it. The gaslighting, the brainwashing is just par excellence, folks. Consequently, the service sector that represents by far the largest component of economic activity in any developed economy, 70 to 80% of the U.S., was hit hardest. Why? Because of arbitrary rules. The service sector, unfortunately, is the largest portion, has been for decades, of the United States. That's an unfortunate issue because service sectors don't pay as well generally. And two, it means we're not manufacturing, guys. And let me tell you a little secret in case you don't know it. We don't want to manufacture. We want to outsource because we want to be weak. This is why the Keystone Pipeline was shut down by Joe Biden after he said he wasn't going to do that. It also suffered from another distinct characteristic contrary to manufacturing or agriculture. Lost revenues and services are gone forever. They cannot be deferred because service companies don't hold inventories or stock raw materials. Exactly. There's no real true commodity there. A service can only be attained in the moment. This is commodity standards are my biggest argument. I'm not telling anyone not to invest, but my biggest argument against Bitcoin. I'm not saying it's not a good idea, maybe, sort of. It's definitely outside of the U.S. monetary supply, but I'll tell you this. It's not a commodity. It's digital. And I'm kind of with Peter Schiff on this stuff, where at any point the digital side of things can just be destroyed. And it has been. There are people that I know that have lost Bitcoin, that it's on some computer somewhere. Completely gone. Just poof. Now, that can happen with any sort of money, don't get me wrong. But my point is that this technology side of things, if technology goes away, which it will be restricted in the way that Klaus Schwab speaks, in the way that many of the global elitist, basically oligarchs think, they want to be able to turn off your purchasing power within seconds, and Bitcoin to me represents that. Now, someone who watches me might argue otherwise, and that's fine, guys. Go invest in it if you wish. For me, I'm going to invest in food and land and ammo and those kind of things that I believe that are important, that are going to get me by, that are going to sustain my life. If you're going to invest in some sort of money, I would always suggest gold because it is the oldest standard that we have to human beings. Anyways, it says they cannot be deferred because service companies don't hold. Because services are in the moment. This is actually an interesting philosophical point, real quick, to go on that, just a little bit of a sidetrack. Services are an interesting thing because they tend to be the most enticing, and I'm thinking very particularly what people find their vices in. Most vices are services, right? Like alcohol, drugs, sex. So on the most extreme example, if you invest in a prostitute, that's a one-time service. Yesterday in our little church meeting, we were reading from Proverbs 6, which speaks about visiting prostitutes or sleeping with a married woman, and it's just a warning to ancient folks not to do this thing. And it's the cost is actually very cheap, but what it does to your soul is much deeper. And that's sort of a good analogy for what's going on with the United States. We have a service industry which costs very cheap, and it's destroying the soul of our nation. It's much deeper because we're not really providing anything of substance. It's all entertainment. It's all fleetingness. It's all, let me go eat food and then become obese and then get more susceptible to this disease that really is quite weak. And don't get me wrong, I have heard of cases where this has affected people long term, which I've been a skeptic of. One of them is a MMA fighter. What's his name? Khamzat Chimaev, who just came out of nowhere the other year, and he was supposed to have this big fight just this past weekend, and it has been canceled and delayed like 3 times, and apparently he's still very sick because he got COVID, which also is another speculation of which I had at some point that perhaps this has a genetic component to it, that certain people with certain genetics, it hits. We know that vitamin D is a big deal with it. But regardless, my bigger point with the service industry thing is that you're paying to go out to waste your money. You're not really investing in anything. You're not making yourself richer. You're actually impoverishing yourself for pleasure. So even though it might not be a vice like drugs or sex, it's still a vice in that you're going out and eating food, you're spending money, maybe you're going to the bar for the social interaction. And guys, don't, look, I am telling you flat out, I'm not necessarily doing all this anymore, but I've been there and I've done all of this, not the prostitution side of things, but I was a man whore at one point. Look, guys, I definitely spent a lot of money dating girls for the purpose of sex, right? My past is my past. What I'm saying here is that we don't think about these things, and that how our nation within itself and the way our industries are set up are purely hedonistic. There is no long-term investment. There is no planning, at least on the surface. And this is a very, very bad thing. Service industries are great for entertainment, but it shows you that we live in a luxury society, because there is no society that has a great amount of poverty that enjoys a service. And I guarantee you, there might be a few people like struggling parents with many children. Of course, I would say that they were irresponsible in having them children, but then you gotta take on your responsibilities once those things happen, even if you didn't plan them. But for the most part, even not very wealthy people in the United States, people who we would consider under the poverty line, can still get services and conveniences, and they often do with drugs and alcohol, and they often do with fast food and other things. And again, this stuff does not serve our spirit and our soul. It does not build up our bodies, and actually makes us more sick. It makes us less healthy, and as I've been trying to say, it destroys our soul and our spirit. It is actually a backwards system. All right, let's keep going. Several months into the pandemic, it looks like even a semblance of return to business as usual for most service companies is inconceivable as long as the COOF remains a threat to our health. This in turn suggests that a full return to normal cannot be envisaged before a vaccine is available. When might that be? According to most experts, it's unlikely to be before the first quarter of 2021 at the earliest. Well, this is a this is a little book that was released, I believe, in June, the end of June or July. So obviously we have numerous prophylactics. They're not actually vaccines. Don't ban me, Susan, wiki, because that is the truth. The word vaccine has a history and a reason, an etymology behind it, and these are prophylactics. They don't fight the virus with the virus, so it's something different. It actually supposedly boosts your immune response. So it says, according to most experts, unlikely before the first quarter. In mid-June 2020, already more than 135 trials were underway, preceded by a remarkable pace. Consider that in the past, it could take up to 10 years to develop a vaccine, 5 in the case of Ebola. And it still does, because we didn't develop one. We developed a prophylactic that boosts immunity to spike proteins that changes your RNA, and we don't know the long-term ramifications. And I'm not here to speculate that this is making you sterile or anything crazy like that, but it is a good beta test to see who is compliant. So the reason is not science, but production. Manufacturing billions of doses constitutes the real challenge that will require a massive expansion and diversion of existing capacity. The next hurdle is the political challenge of vaccinating enough people worldwide. We are collectively as strong as the weakest link, with a high enough compliance rate despite the rise of anti-vaxxers. Okay, first off, let's get into the anti-vaxxers very quickly. Robert Kennedy is the biggest anti-vaxxer out there. He is not right-wing, folks. He is a leftist. Now, I would say he's a moderate leftist. He's a maybe blue dog Democrat. I don't think he's really a blue dog, though, so he's a little bit toward the progressive side, and he is the biggest anti-vaxxer. And all of a sudden, the narrative is, oh, it's all right-wing conspiracy theorists. Do you think that Jenny McCarthy, years ago, when she was complaining about her children being autistic and being an anti-vaxxer during the 90s and early 2000s, I believe it was the late 90s she started with that, but at least in the early 2000s, do you think that Jenny McCarthy was on the right? No. She was dating Jim Carrey at the time. They're leftists, folks. Has that crept into what's on the right? Yes, because there's been a crossover because people are realizing that the political divide is mostly a false dichotomy. And there is no rise. What has happened was there was a release of a new vaccine schedule that was way advanced in the 90s that was giving children vaccines at specific times when it wasn't necessarily good for them or when they were very young or when their immune system wasn't developed, and people questioned it. And that's really the crux of that movement. And if you studied instead of just listening to propaganda like news outlets, you would understand that. And if a vaccine works, by the way, folks, why are you concerned about the virus spreading amongst people who don't want to get it? I never got the argument. I still don't get the argument. It's been around forever. There is a herd immunity. There is a point. Even Fauci talked about this. The CDC talks about this. YouTube, Susan, the CDC talks about this. There is a point of herd immunity. This is old. We know this. A certain point of the population, something like 70 to 90%, need to get the infection or vaccine, and the majority of it is gone. It just can't thrive or exist. That other 20 to 10%, they might get these things on occasion. Sure. Why do you care? They're not part of your globalist system. Why do you care? It's not endangering you. Why would you care if someone did this or not? Unless you need to control everybody and how they think. Why can't you just let people live and believe things that they want to believe? It's like reading Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays, who wrote the book Propaganda, was a marketing specialist. Talks very specifically about how the world was going to have to influence the way people think and direct their thought. They're already doing it now, and they're going to have to come up with better ways. And the world governments and the people in power were going to have to direct society. Folks, these people are megalomaniacs. During the intervening months, the economy will not operate at full capacity, a country-dependent phenomenon dubbed the 80% economy. Companies and sectors as varied as travel, hospitality, rental, or sports and events will face the following triple whammy. Fewer customers who will respond to uncertainty by becoming more risk-averse because of propaganda. Those who consume will spend less on average because of precautionary savings. Well, that's just smart in general. This consumer economy stuff, guys, it's materialism is a way for you to pave your road to hell, essentially. Consumerism is a dead end for a robust and healthy life. Trust me. Transaction cost will be higher. Serving one customer will cost more because of physical distancing and sanitation measures. No, it won't. If we were taking proper sanitation measures in the past in restaurants that we should have been taking all along according to health guidelines or whatever else, this should have died just fine. You know why? Because it's very weak in the open air and it's very weak to sunlight. This is why exposure outside under UV light is not a big deal. And this is also why people walking around outside with masks on is just absolutely absurd and stupid. And you haven't read the science and you're all propagandized and you're basically morons who are sheeple. Taking into account the criticality of service for GDP growth, the richer the country, the greater the importance of services for growth. Not true. This new reality of 80% economy begs the question of whether successive possible shutdowns of business activity in the service sector have the lasting effects on a broader economy through bankruptcies and loss of employment. Which in turn begs the question of whether those possible lasting effects could be followed by a collapse in demand as people lose their income and their confidence in the future. Okay, so let's break this down real quick. Taking into account the critical nature of services, that is, the richer the country, the greater the importance of services for growth. Not true. Do you think Dubai, which has a ton of services, by the way, but do you think Dubai is worried about their services or the fact that the average income, I think, of a 24-year-old in Dubai is 120? Now, this is 10-year-old statistic I remember off the top of my head, so it's probably higher. 120 grand a year. You know why? Oil. You think that's because of service industries? No. No, folks. Commodities make a nation rich. Commodities, manufacturing, production makes you rich. Services you can become rich through, but services are a luxury. And what they're saying right now is the rich countries are losing their luxuries, and that is going to cost these rich countries, and it's so important to their economies. It wouldn't be if we weren't a hedonistic society, if we weren't so libertine. Our monetary policies are libertine. The FDIC promises that, you know, if you have $200,000 in the bank, oh, we'll just bail you out. Was it $250,000? Whatever it is. The FDIC, that's like stupid. Where does that money come from? Well, it comes from the taxpayer. Now, you could invest with some sort of financial insurance outside of that in a private sector. I think that would probably be a good idea. But we don't have that. The government does it. And so it has these trickle-down effects of screwing the economy up all over the place. And that's what this is about. We don't have a lot of manufacturing. We don't have a lot of production. We don't export as much as we once did, which we could. We could have a large export economy. In the U.S., we could be largely self-sustainable. You know, we could have so much self-sustainability because we have so many wonderful natural resources here, and we'd have so many jobs. But we don't, because we got to play this globalist game. And then they got to convince people, oh, the service economy is everything. It's really not. In fact, the service economy is more likely to keep you poor. Trust me, everyone I know that is quite wealthy, and I mean, I have family members who are quite wealthy. They work for like contractors that manufacture stuff. You know, they make stuff. One in particular, works for like Lockheed and all. They make weapons and government contracts and whatever. And does global sales marketing stuff. That's a service economy, but it's manufacturing something. It's not Applebee's, folks. It's not putting food in front of you because you didn't want to cook dinner tonight. My Lord, I cook often, or my wife does. It takes time. I get it. Time is money and whatever else. But getting back to simple, old-fashioned ways, I'm telling you, is way better. My dishwasher broke today or last night or whatever. We use it a lot, but often I hand wash stuff. It's just convenient to use a dishwasher, but that's a luxury, folks. Time to get back to hand washing. It's just how it goes. You know, you improvise, you overcome, and you adapt. All right, let's get finishing up here because I'm at like 35 minutes, I think. Such a scenario will almost inevitably lead to a collapse in investment among business and a surge in precautionary savings among consumers with hold on, that jumped on me. All right, with fallout in the entire global economy through capital flight. The rapid and uncertain movement of large amounts of money out of a country, which tends to exacerbate economic crisis. Well, why would it exacerbate economic crisis, though, if we're in a global economy? This is also going to be one of their arguments, by the way, to switching to a full-on global monetary standard. It's going to streamline everything. It's going to make it simpler. And therefore, we don't have to worry about these different exchange rates. And we don't have to worry about losing money in this nation versus that nation. It's just going to be global. This is also why the hardcore conspiracy folks, the people that are into UFO and alien stuff are all like, I'm just waiting for aliens to come. That's the next thing. That was the thing all year last year, right? Just waiting for the aliens to arrive. Because that's the real call to globalism, folks. When the aliens come, that's going to be it. And I'm not saying aliens are coming or anything like that. I'm just saying that those are the things out there in those spheres. According to the OECD, the immediate yearly impact of the economy having been switched off could be a reduction in the GDP in the G7 countries between 20% and 30%. But again, this estimate depends on the outbreak's duration and severity in each country. The longer lockdowns last, the greater the structural damage they inflict by leaving permanent scars in the economy through job losses, bankruptcies, and capital spending cancellations. As a rule of thumb, every month that large parts of the economy remain closed, annual growth might fall by a further 2% points. And what he's making the case here is if we can never come back from this. And that's just absurd. That's not how economics work. It's not how wealth works, wealth creation works. It just doesn't work this way, guys. Yeah, things falter. There is hard times briefly. And if you leave them be, people pick right back up. The hard times, though, that we are seeing, these are like 95% or more, literally, probably 98% or more, manufactured by governments. If someone had to take off work for a few weeks because they were sick or quarantined, I had a buddy, couldn't go back to work, kept testing positive for the coof. We went out and watched some UFC fights at Wild Wings the other week because he was done and over with it. But I kept testing positive for it. Lives with his girlfriend, never tested positive once for it. She had to stay home from work too. So yeah, there's that. But who's requiring people to stay home from work because of it? As far as I know, my buddy had no symptoms whatsoever. He's perfectly fine. I think his stomach was a little messed up, but he was perfectly fine. I have another buddy, Kizza GT, who's over on Yiz the Eunuch's Corner Club every Friday, helps her co-host, and he's been on our show numerous times, The Ends Justify the Memes. He had it the other week. Seems to be perfectly fine. Now, he had to stay home. Again, though, other people's regulations. And I'm not saying you shouldn't stay home. If you're ill, stay home, guys. I hate this idea. I used to work for a sheriff who was a tyrant, and everyone in the department, they had no idea what leadership was, and they wanted you to come to work. If you took a day off work, they punished you. And people always got sick. I worked at a jail. Wasn't a big jail, but it was big enough, several hundred people. I mean, you're interacting with folks. It's closed, confined quarters, bad ventilation, and when someone gets sick, everybody gets sick. And yet they still write you out and punish you over it. What are you supposed to do? Come into work and get everyone sick? It's bad policy, bad leadership. But that's kind of my point about all that is like on one end or the other, like you should be, as an individual, able to make your own decision if you can go to work or not. And you might say, well, Bill, but this is the worst pandemic ever. And of course it's not. But you might say, what about the people that might die? Well, they can stay home then. That's so cruel and mean. I can think of a progressive right now. How dare you? How dare you? Well, I've even heard people on the right say, well, if you want to have a progressive dream, all the money that we gave and bailouts to all these big corporations and foreign aid to other nations through this last bailout that just passed, as well as the omnibus bill, plus the two bailouts before, you could have gave everyone in the United States, 20 or 30 grand to stay home for 2 months. Could have done that. Of course, not everyone could stay home because things have to get stocked on shelves. Truck drivers have to drive. Farmers have to farm crops. There has to be people interacting. You can't just shut down an economy. It doesn't work that way, folks. People must work. Do you think that the economy shut down during the Black Death? No. We're talking about a third, nearly half actually, like 40% of Europe was destroyed. Do you think people stopped having commerce? Or do you think that they just adjusted around it? Do you think the government shut it down or people did this naturally? Governments back then weren't the way they are now. They didn't have this kind of power or authority or folks to really back up and police these actions. So much so that in Argentina, the nation that had the longest lockdown, still had a 60% infection rate, normal death rate though, and actually their death rate might have been lower. And at the same time, we're having human rights violations, accusations against them, the government, for what they did to maintain lockdown. Anyways, let's keep going because I'm pretty sure I'm almost done here. It says, but again, this estimate depends on the outbreak's duration and severity in each country. The longer lockdowns last, the greater the structural damage they inflict by leaving permanent scars in the economy through job losses. Yeah. Like, whatever. So when someone dies, that is a permanent scar in the economy due to a job loss because it's one less worker out of the economy. This isn't how it works, folks. It is not how it works at all. This guy has I think he has got some sort of doctorate in economics too, which just tells me that he basically studied a bunch of stuff and a bunch of theory that's not practical. Versus me and my books on Austrian economics and Chicago school style economics. Go listen to Academic Agent, by the way, if you want to learn about some good economics, because 100% with that dude. When it comes to his stances on free markets, essentially. Anyways, as a rule of thumb, every month that large parts of the economy remain closed, annual growth might fall by a further 2 percentage points. But as we would expect, the relationship between the duration of restrictive measures and the corresponding impact on GDP is not linear. The Dutch Central Planning Bureau found that every additional month of containment results in a greater, non-proportional distortion of economic activity. According to the model, a full month of economic hibernation would result in a loss of 1.2% in Dutch growth in 2020, while 3 months would cause a 5% loss. Interesting, though, that Schwab's bringing up the Dutch because they didn't have really hard lockdowns until recently, nor mask mandates. Just go watch Styx Sixenhammer's content because Styx is a great political analyst, and I'll tell you right now, he's been living in the Netherlands for some time. He was back home. I think he's back in the Netherlands. I've been watching a little bit less of his content lately. But, he married a Dutch woman here in the last year or so, and he's been down there for the lockdowns. For the regions and countries that have already exited lockdowns, it is too early to tell how GDP growth will evolve. At the end of June 2020, some V-shaped data, like the Eurozone Purchasing Manufacturing Index and a bit of the anecdotal evidence generated a stronger than expected rebound narrative. But we should not get carried away for two reasons. The marked improvement in PMI in the Eurozones and the US does not mean that these economies have turned the corner. So what he's telling you now is because economies are doing well, we should still be skeptical because his theories and his beliefs suggest that this can't happen. So any contra evidence, right, is going to be met with skepticism by him, of course, just like I'm meeting him with my skepticism. Of course, I've been looking at the data since the beginning of this and have made numerous videos on it. Not saying that Schwab hasn't or he doesn't have a team of people. That I do not have. I'd love to have a team of people. But Schwab has all that in his access. But what Schwab has versus what I have is an agenda. I have no agenda other than to have a strong society. So maybe I have the counter agenda to his agenda, which is, I'm pretty sure, global enslavement. For your own good, though. For your own good. It simply indicates that business activity has improved compared to previous months. Oh, that's all. That's all. It just indicates it's improved, which is natural since a significant pickup in activity should follow a period of inactivity caused by rigorous lockdowns. Man, this is just stupid. In terms of future growth, one of the most meaningful indicators to watch is the savings rates. Always has been, but since not you, but the centralized banks artificially inflate the money supply and artificially change the interest rates, this is not a good indicator at all. If we had a free market, it would be actually a meaningful indicator, but not really of growth. It actually is an indicator of restriction. When people save, there's a restriction in the economy, and there's an expansion when they start spending. See, that's where growth comes at, is spending. That's why the Keynesians constantly want to spend. It's all supply side, as they call it. You want to spend, and continue to inflate the money supply in the economy. It's a bubble. It's always a bubble that must crash. And then when you have a lockdown, that's all the perspective that Klaus was talking about. Then when you have a lockdown, then you can go, well, look, with the service economy had the lockdown and the GDP. This is the luxury. The wealthy people had to have this for the economy to go. No, when the service industry goes, it shows you what our real economy is. That's all. If we were at war, and we were at war on United States soil, that service economy would be gone, guys. Because we would be at war. Now, we might still manufacture, but not with the service economy. We would be manufacturing weapons of war and things for soldiers and whatever else. So let's realize what he's saying here is backwards. The most meaningful indicator of future growth is saving rates. Potential future growth. Growth in the meantime, as I was saying, is about spending, which is why the Keynesians, the centralized planners, are always trying to spend, and artificially keep the rates low. And when a bubble's coming up, they lower the rates even more, which just accelerates the bubble that's going to happen, which then brings the economic downturn. And if you want to read about this, guys, go look up Ludwig von Mises and go look up his burst bubble economy cycle and how he sees how centralized banking does this. He won a Nobel Prize in the 70s, I believe, over this, and taught here in the U.S. for quite a long time and has some of the most sound economics out there. In April, immediately during the lockdown, the U.S. personal savings rate climbed to 33%, while in a Eurozone, the household savings rate, calculated differently than the U.S. personal savings rate, rose by 19%. They will both significantly drop as the economies reopen, but probably not enough to prevent these rates from remaining at historically elevated. So again, exactly what I was just saying. People couldn't spend because everything was shut down, so maybe they saved some, but then opens back up, spend. So the savings has nothing to do with the growth of the economy, guys. The savings is while the economy is restricted. Always is. Always will be. The centralized banks try to make that an inverse, though. Economies are expanding when people start investing in things. They start building things. They start manufacturing things. That's when they expand. And they can only do that when people can purchase. So there is no expansion without purchase. In its World Economic Outlook update published in June 2020, the International Monetary Fund warned about a crisis like no other and an uncertain recovery. Compared to April, it revised its projection for global growth downwards, anticipating global GDP at the 4.9% in 2020, almost 2 percentage points below its previous estimate. And that's about it today, guys. That's 50 minutes of me reading this stuff off and trying to keep these segments to 30 minutes. But hey, we got a little bit further than maybe I normally would. And hopefully you guys stuck through it. And hopefully you all enjoyed it. And hopefully I can push through this in the next few weeks because we're still in chapter 1 and there's like 3 chapters to this thing. But it will take a while if I'm going to talk through it, which I'm going to do because I just don't agree with this guy. I just do not. But I'm not a multimillionaire throwing cool parties in Davos with all these other multimillionaire, 100-millionaire, billionaire folks that get to decide the future and fate of the world. I'm just some guy who puts videos up on the interwebs and hopes that you'll listen and realize that that this is part of the beast system, if you would, the kingdom of Satan, and that you all need to do better. And if you want to protect your families, you need to reject all of this stuff. So I don't know. I'm sure there's somebody out there that'll one day find me and go, "This guy's crazy." Hey, man, I think I had that my first story time, actually. And I don't mean Klaus Schwab, I mean me. Sure. I mean, I think Christ's family thought he was crazy too. They said he was beside himself. Whatever. Guys, I'm going to probably try to release another one of these on Wednesday. Maybe I'll record tomorrow or later on today, depending on when I have a chance. But I will try and release more on Wednesday. I'll try and get 2 of these out a week for now till we get through them. And I want to continue to read from Eugene Rose's Nihilism, and that's a pretty profound document. So I'll be covering that every Thursday. In any case, guys, thank you all for watching. This has been All Minus One Story Time with Bill, and we are reading The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab. And with all that, I just want to say I wish you all well.